a building and different balconies that give us different perspectives to the street, to the passers-by, to the life unfolding in a city. And then he mentions, in the absence of which you could content yourself with a window. This is the classic image, the classic metaphor. How can we look at a city, from a balcony or a window? And as you know, sometimes photography is also considered metaphorically a sort of a window to the world, because there is a frame, you choose to look at some things, and within this frame things are happening, of course, in an immobilized way. In this context of constant movement and flow, simultaneity and immobility point, according to Lefebvre, to an intensification of the present, what he calls a defining feature of modernity. The only remarks in this book on rhythm analysis that he makes on photography concern mostly this idea of immobility through photography, that it's just an intensification of the present. Like if photography would forget what is happening in this movement and flow. However, Lefebvre counters this by emphasizing the importance of what he calls present, as opposed to present. Present time, which can be too narrow, too small for grasping rhythms. But then he adds, well, if this immobility, this capacity to look at the city from a perspective, is able to not only to intensify the present, but to give presence to something, then it becomes much more rich, much more interesting. This immobility, to analyze, capacity to look at this presence from a point is not limited to occupying some transitory or ephemeral place in a society dominated by images and media discourse. It is the presence ascribed to some image that allows this image to be something more than just a limited image that circulates in media discourse or in social media. Of course, Lefebvre didn't experience social media how we are experiencing today, but that for an image to have presence, that's what is calling our attention. And how is it possible to think this? Well,
Yo ya me explicó, pero no pude grabar allá dentro de la cabina, entonces ahorita hago un videillo y lo mando por acá. Ya.
Ability to capture the present in a way that opens it up to presence, to the multiplicity of rhythms, to memory, to history, and the diversity of movements of time. So it's me saying this, not Lefebvre, but as I interpret this idea of presence, and if we want to make it interesting for photography, is how can memory or interest or history or the many rhythms of an urban environment, how can they enter into the present of an image? This is the task, I think, that Lefebvre is giving us. Therefore, it is important to consider the realistic and documentary nature of photography as a form of interruption that creates.
Hola Medianis, ¿cómo vas? Bueno, ya todo resultó bien a pesar de todo. Ahí se está transmitiendo, todo good. ¿Hay más pantallas de carga, digamos, para cada una de las charlas? ¿O no? Para ya tenerlas descargadas en el computador de Paco, que es el que vamos a utilizar de aquí en adelante en el resto de transmisiones y de presentaciones. ¿Qué otra cosa? Creo que no es nada más, creo.
From this brief incursion into Lefebvre's rhythm analysis, I would like to highlight 4 main points. And I have just sketched them so that we can better so that you can better follow my discourse and my arguments. The first one is the diversity and complexity of everyday rhythms, particularly in an urban environment. This is what Lefebvre is describing. The second one is that rhythm analysis is a task that takes place simultaneously inside and outside rhythms, inside and outside everyday life, and inside and outside the present and the direct experience of the city. So how are we able to be in the present, but at the same time allowing other forms of temporality to enter our relationship with the city, our daily relationship, but also our photographic relationship with the city. The third one is the implications of all this for our bodily experience and gestures that are fundamental to any approach attempting to reconcile the aesthetic and political dimensions. The challenge, the fourth one, the challenge for photographers is to work with time in its rhythmic dimension and to be inside and outside rhythms in a way that opens critical perspectives on everyday life. So this would be my challenge for us as researchers or practitioners of photography. Of course, we can discuss this after, and I would think that's much. I will now move on to the third topic, different approaches to the city and to works by the Portuguese photographer Pedro Letria. So what I will do now is something quite basic from perhaps that any course on photography, any photographer or professor of photography knows better than me, but I will just show a few images on different approaches to a city, photographically speaking, of course. And then I want to focus on Pedro Letria's work. So, of course, I will start with street photography. These classic examples of, for instance, walker heavens, subway passengers, how photography was able to, with the technical advancements, was able to go deeper and deeper into the different layers of society and of a city. In this case, the underground cities, the underground of New York City, and what kind of personal relationships were being built in these particular urban environments. So people have a particular way of relating and looking at each other in these experiences. I'll just move a little bit. We'll not discuss these images, but of course just showing some examples like Gary Winogrand, street photography. How can we catch these glimpses, these moments that are so characteristic of urban movement, and so on. Just another William Klein and so on and so on. We have, of course, many examples in street photography with different styles, with different approaches. And one photographer, a Japanese photographer that I really like, Daido Moriyama. It's interesting because here, of course, we have the grain, the unbalanced, but at the same time quite coherent work that is creating throughout his already huge career. And of course, we can look at these photographers, of perhaps Daido Moriyama is the best example, as photographers that relate in a certain sense in a reactive way to the street. They have they dive into the everyday street, perhaps with their smaller cameras that are able to capture these ephemeral situations. So like even bodily, physically, the relationship that these photographers have with the street, we can imagine that it's different from other cases that I will show next. And so we have another tradition, if we want to put this in terms of tradition, but you can, again, I come back to Atget, and of course, Atget has this important corpus of photography in which created some kind of a lineage in photography, mostly concerned with observing and giving us space and time to look at the streets. And here, if we want to contrast this with the previous photographs, what is striking is also the absence of the human figure. So we have this street photography full of movement and so on, and then we have this tradition much more with a different rhythm. So it's something that a different temporality, different rhythm that is entering these pictures. The whole tradition that followed the interest of photography for what the architect Solá Morales called the terrain vague, these spaces normally close to industrial or the outskirts, industrial areas or the outskirts of cities. So the interest that photography, especially since the 70s and the 80s, had for these transitory spaces, these enigmatic spaces where the city was not producing exactly, but something was happening. And then the photographic movement, the new topographics, just brought this to cover from Stephen Shore and Common Places. And so I'm just bringing some different examples of how can a city be represented and experienced through photography with different temporalities, with different spaces, and with different rhythms. And a more recent case in Thomas Struth. So here again we have the possibility of reading these contradictory spaces in which at the same time we have development, these huge buildings that seem to have been born here, and they are in a certain conflict with the rest of the landscape. It seems like there is not a city here, even if these buildings are related to a city. What kind of city is this? What kind of future is being projected by these huge constructions? So photography, of course, can also question us about the present and the certain notions related to urban development, of course, and the future, if we want. And now I want to come back to Lisbon and to focus on two Portuguese photographers. This is not Lisbon, this is England, but this is the work by Portuguese photographer Paulo Catrica, who has this work on the post-war cities built in England, because he is in this project he had really he had an interest in understanding how these utopian new cities, new towns were being what kind of development that in the last decades how these new towns had, and how can we in the present relate to this utopian constructions, utopian era in which the cities were developing according to certain ideals, certain patterns of what life should be. So Paulo Catrica is coming back to this neighborhoods, to these areas of certain cities in England. And then, he also has this work on stadia, in which at the European the football, the Campeonato Europeu de Futebol in 2004, we had in Portugal many new stadiums built, which costed a lot, and so simultaneously, at the same time, he was portraying this stadia, which are much more connected to daily life, and of course, and also with a particular landscape in the Portuguese country, in Portugal. So it's also an interesting, I just brought these examples because I like them. And I think that Paulo Catrica follows this tradition in a certain sense of how to look at a city, which is not street photography, but it's something else. And now I want to move to Pedro Letria. Pedro Letria, born in 1965, is a Portuguese photographer whose work focuses on urban themes, among others. The image we are looking at is part of a project commissioned by Lisbon's public institutions in the 1990s, in which Letria participated alongside other photographers. Letria looked for areas on the outskirts of the city where new residential developments coexisted with large avenues and vestiges of and remnants of the past. The scenes are slow-paced and have little human presence. When human figures do appear, they lend the composition an enigmatic quality. The contrasts between the different buildings, spaces, and infrastructures are what clearly stand out. So this is typical of Lisbon's landscape in the outskirts of the city in the 90s. Now I want to jump to 2023. Published in 2023, the book Lisboa, Mesma Outra Cidade, or in English, Lisbon, the Same Other City, revisits the concept of commissioned collective work as the previous case, which was called Lisboa Anos 90, and here is Lisboa, la misma otra ciudad. It's a bit ironic, the title. So this book, this collective project, revisits the concept of a commissioned work, collective work, and Pedro Letria is joining the project again. But now, this work that I'm showing now, it's 163, is completely different from previous works. Here, Pedro Letria focuses on the building that houses the Campo Lide Atlético Clube, a sports and cultural association with over 100 years of history. The building houses also several residents that live in generally precarious conditions. It is important to note that the photographer has strong connections to this area of the city, which lends the work a personal quality. So, if we compare the other approach to Lisbon, distance, it's all about landscape, almost like if the emotional attachment is absent. Here, in the photographs and also in the text that were published with the photographs that I'm not reproducing here, this emotional attachment is quite important, or at least this idea that the photographer belongs to the city. but at the same time it's distancing from it. For about I'm just showing some of the images. For about 2 decades, Lisbon has undergone a process of profound transformation, like that experienced by other capitals, connected to tourism, the gentrification of various areas, and real estate speculation. And the last 15 to 20 years have been fatal to Lisbon in terms of this radical transformation. Community centers linked like this Atlético club, community centers linked to the city's history are becoming increasingly rare, and the resistance movements associated with them are not immune to contradictory forces. In this sense, focusing on this building and the people who live in or visit it is also a way of documenting a moment in the city's present and daily life, allowing us to understand its different temporalities. So I thought that, of course, we have different ways of approaching a city, and even the format of these images is completely different. It's not, you don't have a landscape, we have mostly portraits, and this is the aesthetics of a portrait. And it's interesting that after 20 years or 20 and something years, Pedro Lutia has come back to Lisbon, and now what he wants to show us is the contradictions that can be deciphered from a building, how a building contains in itself an image of the city, and the contradictions and the processes of becoming something else. And now I'll move to my fourth section, images and everyday life, deciphering and estrangement, Siegfried Kracauer. In this fourth section, I would like to focus on some text by Siegfried Kracauer, a German author who went into exile in the United States of America in the 1930s and was one of the greatest cultural critics of the Weimar Republic. So I'm now moving to concepts after some images. Today, he is perhaps best known for his work on cinema, but he also wrote seminal texts on the city and photography. I will mainly address 2 concepts, as I mentioned, deciphering and estrangement. These concepts are particularly relevant when considering the aesthetic and political power of photography in relation to urban images. The term images I'm employing the term images in a double sense. Firstly, I refer to photographic images. And secondly, to refer to mental and material images as components of social relations. In other words, this is the more broader, and images as a broader shared representations we make of cities. The sense that I was giving it at the beginning. No? In the text Seen from the Window, a chapter from the book Streets in Berlin and Elsewhere, Kracauer states that there are 2 ways of looking at images of a city. The first one concerns those images that are consciously conceived, such as those that appear in the Baedeker guides. And is here referring to Karl Baedeker, a German who was, so to speak, the founder of the tourist guides for cities already in the 19th century. So is calling our attention that these are the type of images of a city that are consciously produced under their plans. They are guide, clear in a certain sense. But then he considers a second type of images, those that arise unintentionally, without planning, resulting from chance, not aiming at what is called a unified whole, no? No visa un todo unificado. These images, this second case, they cannot be held responsible for anything. They arise from heterogeneous interests and often lie dormant over time. Like if they would go through the unconscious of time and maybe reappear after some decades after. No? They are not planned. Kracauer text then describes a characteristic urban scene, observing everyday life from a window. So there is an interesting affinity between this text and Lefebvre's text. The window overlooks a relatively quiet square, far from the hustle and bustle of the main avenues. Pedestrians are predominate here, and from a distance, the structure and rhythm of the movement of the pedestrians also evoke, according to Kracauer, a kind of a child's model, as if a child was playing with the pedestrians and with the movements of the street. However, this is not the panoramic view that Michel de Certeau describes at the beginning of his well-known chapter on walking in the city in the book called The Practice of Everyday Life, which is the chapter that begins with this image of someone looking at New York City from above, from the Twin Towers, the way they exist, like it's the gaze of power over a city. What kind of perspective does this represent? No, it's not the case here. This is much closer to the ground, and at the same time, it evokes the movement. The pedestrians are seen. No? They can be the movements of the pedestrians can somehow be accessed. Well, as there is no English translation of this text, I will quote a Spanish translation, because I want to read it a bit more closely with you. Further on the text, after distinguishing between those two types of images, those that can be planned, like in a tourist guides, and those that are not able, that cannot be planned, that come from the unconscious. He says this. I'm sorry for my Spanish. Este paisaje es Berlín sin pose alguna. En él, que ha crecido espontáneamente, se expresan sin intención sus contradicciones, su dureza, su sinceridad, sus sobreposiciones, su esplendor. Lo conocimiento de las ciudades se enlaza con el desciframiento de las imágenes oníricas que se dicen sin pensar. Well, Kracauer is not talking about photography here. This is it's a small text on cities, of city life, on city experience. And this concept of images is not strictly photographic, but at the same time, the perspective is quite interesting because it's looking at the city from a window. You know? And it's calling our attention to the fact that what is perhaps more interesting in the images that we produce about the city is their oniric character, the possibility looking at the city that they have as enigmas. And it's calling our attention that can be deciphered. The fact that what that is cannot be fully controlled, the images that we produce about the city, in the tourist guides. This task of deciphering is linked to the importance that Kracauer attaches to what he calls the surface phenomena, los fenómenos de superficie, as he discusses them in the book The Mass Ornament. This expression refers to ephemeral, marginal, and imperceptible phenomena often characteristic of mass culture, which allow us to decipher fundamental aspects of modern life. And again, we are dealing with an author like Lefebvre, like Walter Benjamin, whose work pays attention to everyday life, to what is called the surface of things. Like the most important thing is already at the surface. And if we want to go deeper, it's okay, but don't forget the surface. This is what these authors are calling our attention to. It's not just a way of doing sociology, it's something else. The notion of deciphering, which can be, of course, be problematic, we can discuss this, should not be understood here from a position of exteriority, of full exteriority in relation to what is being deciphered. This would be closer to an ideological critique of unconscious motivations, and again, in which case we might be tempted to associate these images with Adorno or Horkheimer's critique of culture industry, of the critique of mass culture. So this is not the case for Kracauer. It is not a matter of explanatory reason, of explaining things rationally. Images with, however, Adorno understood well the importance of the immobilization that is characteristic of figurative thinking, such as the figurative thinking that Kracauer is proposing us here. And also the particular relationship that this philosophical writing form has with dreams. So the idea of dreams, of the oniric, is quite important to this context of thinking. Because what is manifested through images should not be treated with a mistrust, like a force that distorts reality. Like reality itself is always distorted, is always contradictory. It's the case for Kracauer. The presentation of thought through these thought images that these authors are developing, of course, should preserve a form of truth that would allow it to relate it to a particular knowledge of cities. No, this is a bit abstract, but then I can come back to it in the discussion if you wish. I will now turn to the notion of estrangement, to the second concept that I wanted to pinpoint in relation to Kracauer. And here there is a direct relationship to photography. Well, one of Kracauer's texts devoted to photography exhibitions in Berlin, written in 1932, and entitled "On the Border of Yesterday," on the Berlin exhibition of photography and film, focuses on a large exhibition aimed at creating a future museum of photography and film. The article, it's a really small text on this exhibition. The article provides an overview of the exhibition and focuses mainly on the various technological advances that connect the early days of photography and cinema at the time, at the 30s. But more relevant to my conference today are the opening words that introduce a sort of general understanding of photography. It's like a sort of ontology of photography that is being proposed here. According to Kracauer, this exhibition allows us to make visible a hidden life in which we are immersed. Once revealed, it confronts us with its strangeness, and he stresses this idea of a strangeness that stems from this exhibition on Berlin. This is, of course, quite close to Benjamin's optical unconscious. But we already see this element of strangeness standing out in Kracauer's text. He will develop this in other texts. On the other hand, it is the comments in this small text in the comments on Diepp's first photograph, a banal window of some Parisian house, and again we come to the idea of a window, and here it's like the first photograph by Diepp's was a photograph made from a window. It's also quite interesting. And this, and I quote, a banal window of some Parisian house that marked the profound relationship that photography has with the banal and with the ephemeral things that are fixed in image and thus somehow rescued from disappearance. Moving on. In Kracauer's work, we can identify an aesthetic of photography that maintains a privileged relationship with reality while being compatible with the idea of a mosaic and the constructive principles that underlie the formation of concepts and ideas. So this is an author like Walter Benjamin, for who the technical components of photography are fundamental, but at the same time, they are thinking already about mosaics, construction, montage, concepts and ideas. How can we think photography at different levels? And the interruptive nature, this is one important concept for me today, the idea of the fact that photography interrupts something, interrupts time in a certain sense. The interruptive nature of photography is also an essential factor in this aesthetic that Kracauer is proposing. This is, of course, one of the several aspects that connect his ideas with those of Walter Benjamin. From a stylistic point of view, Kracauer can also be considered a precursor of brief forms commonly referred to as thought images. In German is the concept of Denkbilder, which also there were many authors writing these short texts like snapshots, like photographs of the city in a literary form. And the evolution of this mode of writing is the result of several factors. Among these factors, the pursuit of experimental forms that are less constrained by the systematic deductions of philosophy has played a significant role. So these were philosophers or thinkers that were experimenting different ways of writing. Short text in which an idea was being intensely developed. And these experimental forms are also closely associated with the contemporary phenomenon of fragmentation, particularly within the context of urban environments. And it is not by chance that many of these texts depict urban scenes, like if big cities, metropolis, demanded other ways of writing. And whilst it is challenging to provide concrete evidence demonstrating that the direct involvement of photography in this experimental process, it's difficult to prove this, to demonstrate that photography also played a role in this experimental text. It's not by chance, I think, that several authors, including Kracauer, have reflected upon photography not only as an object and a technique, but also as a means of thought, as a way of experiencing time, history, and cities differently. So like if the fragmentation and interruption that photography was operating in the images of cities had some kind of reflection on writing itself in the literary forms. And to conclude this idea of estrangement, still about the concept of estrangement, I would like to refer to the opening chapter of perhaps the major book by Kracauer, Theory of Film, The Redemption of Physical Reality. And this first chapter is devoted entirely to photography, in which Kracauer quotes a passage from Marcel Proust's The Way to Guermantes. In this passage, the protagonist Marcel enters the room where his grandmother is, unannounced and after a long absence. Marcel feels himself to be in the role of the photographer, writes Proust, observing from outside. An alienated person who does not interfere in or become emotionally attached to the scene. And Kracauer quotes this passage from Proust. And he does not reduce his understanding of photography to this detachment, to this alienation, but reveals, according to Kracauer, this detachment reveals the power of alienation as one of the basic aesthetic principles of photography. The power that photography has to create some strangeness. No? It is, in essence, a question of estrangement, which had already been conceived in previous texts by Kracauer. And this stems, to my view, from a dual and paradoxical function of photography. While familiarizing us with our urban surroundings, photography also gives us an experience of defamiliarization. So this is kind of a paradox. Again, this idea of being inside and being outside. And I think Kracauer's texts are also interesting because they give us interesting concepts with which to think about this paradox of being inside and outside. Make a small pause for myself and for
of course, please.
Rhythms are also important in a conference.
No, it's very interesting.
We have limited time here, but so this pause is connected with the fifth section, the power of interruption. The book by John Roberts that I mentioned at the beginning explores a notion of photographic interruption that stems from the technical dimension but goes beyond it. In other words, the idea that photography captures a moment and interrupts the flow of time has further conceptual consequences, which Roberts considers in relation to Walter Benjamin's thinking. According to Benjamin, montage techniques and the concept of the dialectical image both entail and I quote Roberts, entail an interruption of the received context in which an object is inserted in order to temporalize its identity. End of quote. Again, the idea that by interrupting a present moment, interrupting the context of an object, we are more easily able to give these objects, give this phenomenon other temporalities. And this gives rise to a process of aesthetic fragmentation that denatures the present in order to better penetrate it. Now the question here, the philosophical question, also the photographic, would be, what's the best way to penetrate the present, to access the present? It should also be noted that for Benjamin, the notions of interruption and caesura are linked to diverse aesthetic phenomena, including photography, Bertolt Brecht's epic theater, and montage procedures in various artistic and technological media, from radio to cinema, and so on and so on. So montage was already from the beginning of the 20th century, as you all know, a fundamental procedure in many technological media. Furthermore, for Walter Benjamin, interruption is also an important part of a philosophical and historical method. Well, and I allow myself to be a bit more philosophical and, if you want, abstract and perhaps enigmatic when we can discuss this, and to bring this quote by Benjamin, because it shows that the very concept of interruption, well, on the one hand, it's part of photography, it's part of epic theater, but also it's part of philosophical thinking and an understanding of history, or at least Benjamin's understanding of history. And I quote, "To thinking belongs the movement as well as the arrest of thoughts. Where thinking comes to a standstill in a constellation saturated with tensions, there the dialectical image appears. It is the caesura in the movement of thought. Its position is naturally not an arbitrary one. It is to be found in a world where the tension between dialectical opposites is greatest. Hence, the object constructed in the materialist presentation of history is itself the dialectical image. The latter, the dialectical image, is identical with the historical object. It justifies its violent expulsion from the continuum of historical process." From this complex but rich idea regarding the importance of the arrest, the immobilization, the interruption, both for thinking, what Benjamin is saying is like, well, for thinking, we have to stop. We have to make pauses. And these pauses are fundamental. But also in terms of what he says, how he describes the task of the historian, the materialist historian. It's not to describe the facts, the historical facts chronologically, but this historian should be able to somehow arrest the movements of history. Of course, Benjamin is calling here this movement, is somehow equating this movement with the notion of progress, which was something that he inherited from the 19th century, and the idea that the historical time is moving to a certain point. Well, what the historian should do is to destroy this idea of continuity, to interrupt things, because to create some kind of a polarity between what he calls the present time and the past time, and this will create a certain image. This figurative conception of Benjaminian philosophy of history is a methodological principle that aims to access dialectical images, and in particular the historical constellations of the city of Paris in the 19th century. So he was proposing this understanding of dialectical images while thinking about a city, Paris in the 19th century. And while thinking about this city and compiling an enormous amount of documents and materials about Paris in the 19th century, and doing this in the 20th century. And somehow, for Benjamin, the only possibility of understanding his own time, his own present, was to come back to the origins, according to him, of some contradictions, of some issues that were already dormant, if you want, in a period of the 19th century. So he needed somehow a different type of history. And this concerns the possibility of reading the images of the past. And the legibility of historical facts, according to Benjamin, can only be obtained at a given moment through a polarity between the what has been and the what he calls the now time, which is not exactly the present, it's the now time. In a sense, it is the very complexity and multiplicity of the modern city that demands this methodological principle. Why? Because modern city, and Paris as a perfect example in the 19th century, is full of contradictions between traditions and modern times. The things that come from the past and industrial revolution and the things that were quickly changing. And the question is, aren't all our cities a conflation of contradictions between different temporalities, between different historical temporalities? So how can we deal with them if we don't follow, in a certain sense, this proposal by Benjamin to understand the present while taking into considerations the what has been and the tension that are thus created, no? And of course, for Benjamin, the city is a privileged place for deciphering the essential features and images of modernity. Well, to conclude, I will go to the sixth. I still have time, Guillermo.
Yeah, we have time. Go ahead.
Micro gestures and photography after Jeff Wall. So I will interrupt and jump to another topic, which I hope to demonstrate that is connected with all that we were looking at previously, but answered in a specific and micrological way. I will talk about a photography that you all know quite well, and I just think it's interesting because it's a complex and problematic photographer in a certain sense. Okay, this is if Jeff Wall is a photographer or an artist, but I think that what he's proposing is also interesting in terms of this connection between time, city, and photography. Well, this section concerns another topic that I found fascinating, which is gestures. Gestures can be understood both as expressions of subjugation to power and external governmentalities. In the sense of Michel Foucault, like we are governed in many ways, and also our bodies and our gestures are conditioned by relationships of power. The way we sit, the way we behave in public. Well, this is all the education that we received, the training that we received in our factories, in our offices, in our universities. Well, our gestures are domesticated in a certain sense. They are governed, no? And we often reproduce these gestures unconsciously. No? But gestures can be components of a critical attitude. This critical perspective encompasses not only the self and individual everyday gestures, but also the ethical and collective dimension that emerges from sharing the dynamics of social embodiment with others. No? Our bodies, at both the micro and the macrological level, reproduce sides and can potentially subvert the elements of domination embedded in these dynamics. When gesture is framed as an interruption, both the structure of action and its temporal dimensions are disrupted. And well, I started with Francis Alice. He's a performer, he's an artist and a performer. He performs gestures in a city. He uses his body to perform things. And the dancer knows this very well, because dancers work with and through gestures in order to give expression to something that is not strictly productive in the sense that we are discussing here socially. So performance artists, dancers know this really well. But how can this topic be thought of or practiced in photography? No, so this is the question here. Thus, beyond the strictly productive or cumulative time of progress and the rhythms of disciplinary exercises, alternative temporalities and modes of exercise can be experienced through gestures. Drawing on this, I will conclude by turning to Jeff Wall's work as a systematic exploration of everyday gestures. Works like Mimic, Milk, this one from 1984, Overpass from 2001, Parent-Child from 2018, spanning different scenes and demanding different interpretations. All these works bear on the stillness of the photographic mechanism to expose the tensions and power relations that pervade everyday life. These dynamics, often latent in the image, and again, somehow unconscious, strange, these tensions are rendered striking through their micrological focus. Even in the large format characteristic of Wall's work, it normally exposes in large format, but the attention goes to the details, to the small scale things happening in the picture as well, of course. Well, in Mimic, subjects seem to be completely absorbed in their daily activities, in apparently banal but remarkable events. Photography's capacity to give meaning to details, rescuing them from the flow of life, unfolds from and goes beyond what happens in painting. It is in this sense that Mimic can be said to dialogue with Gustave Caillebot's impressionist painting Rue de Paris, Temps de Bleu from 1877. As they both mimic and this painting share an interest in everyday life in the city. Still, the techniques used and the way they combine gestures and atmospheres point in completely different directions. Mimic's photographic atmosphere helps to expose the details and thus sets the tone for a series of small gestures and expressions that reveal racial and social tensions. The bearded man shows hostility toward the Asian-looking man, and the whole image is thus invested with this tension. Several commentators on Wall's work, in particular Michael Fried, have identified the threads that are woven throughout this piece. Firstly, it belongs to a period in the 1980s in which the Canadian artist devoted himself more deliberately to social issues, as a sort of reinterpretation of Baudelaire's painting of modern life. Secondly, the photograph was staged and produced to reenact a real-life scene that Wall himself had observed. So Wall saw something like this one day in the street, and then he enacted and staged this scene. In this sense, it subverts and plays with the tradition and conventions of street photography that we saw previously. This picture is not the result of a photographer walking through the streets with a small 35mm camera, looking around for motifs to which he could react and capture. This photograph, this picture, does not result from a decisive moment in Cartier-Bresson's sense, even if it's something decisive happening here. In this play with the conventions of street photography, questions arise concerning the supposed naturalness and spontaneity of the photographed, and how the photographer relates to subjects, things that are never, in fact, linear in photography. Gestures performed in scenes of urban everyday life correspond to one of the main strands of Jeff Wall's work. Moreover, in a short text entitled Gestures, a text by Jeff Wall, he himself highlights certain aspects of human gesture that relate to what we have already seen. Wall positions his work in terms of a discussion on the representation of the body, relating it to the expressive gestures that constitute a kind of emblem, a form of manifestation that, according to him, knows itself to be appearance. And on the other hand, the gesture is also, and I quote, a pose or action which projects its meaning as a conventionalized sign. End of quote. So it's a sign to be read, something that should be read in a certain sense. The mechanism of this projection of meaning, is not made explicit by Jeff Wall. It's a real small text. It doesn't explain a lot, but it's interesting that he's comparing his own work with the ideas of gesture. So it does not explain the mechanism of this projection, and the text then moves toward another distinction between Baroque gestuality and its theatrical dimension, and I brought a Caravaggio just as an example. So it distinguishes between Baroque gestuality and its theatrical dimension, and what he calls the modern, mechanized, and automated gestuality linked to the life of cities. As if cities demanded, and modern cities demanded and imposed on us other ways of gestuality, other gestures and other ways of behaving bodily. From the point of view of ancient aesthetics, these mechanical and automatic movements would not really be gestures in the full sense, for they are smaller, often reactive, and hardly express anything. They are micro gestures that come from the bowels of modern society and are expressed in the individual body. But their smallness has a counterpoint: the existence of devices, such as photography, that allow them to be enlarged, better visualized, and potentially analyzed. Again, one can relate this to the optical unconscious of Walter Benjamin. So what Wall is equating here is that at the same time, we had the metropolis, the 19th century big metropolis like Paris, London, and of course our contemporary cities that create these forms of gestuality. On the one hand, we have this, but simultaneously, we had photography. And photography is that technical device that is perfect to analyze this, because it interrupts and gives us time to analyze what is happening here as in an enigmatic form. Okay, there is no flow of light. This is not a film. So we are faced with this immobilization of an image of a city. So on the one hand, photography allows for the study of gestures. On the other hand, when it comes to urban space, this study often takes on a social and political dimension. In any case, the presence and absence of the human element, the permeability of urban life and gestures and their atmospheres allow us to better understand and feel cities, as well as being, of course, these ways are ways for photographers to fine-tune their relationship with space, time, and others. Because this is not only a task for spectators to look at the picture, but the way that photography fosters this study of the social, political, and aesthetic dimensions of urban space is, of course, a way for, according to myself, a way for photographers to fine-tune their relationship with space-time and others. And if we go back to the case of the Portuguese photographer Pedro Letria, that I showed these two works that I showed to you, we can of course understand the second work as a way for himself to fine-tune, to better relate to a city that is transforming itself rapidly. So different approaches, different photographic approaches can also be different ways of relating to a city in terms of style, in terms of personal attachment, but also in terms of detachment from a city. And photography allows this display of distance, display of temporalities. Well, and so I conclude, not with a closed thesis on the relationship between photography, time, and the city, but with, I hope, an open ending. After a path through photographic and theoretical examples that, I hope, help us understand the demanding tasks that our present time places upon us. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Nélio. Excellent. Very interesting. Since we had a little technical problem at the beginning, we don't have much time, but I will nevertheless like to make you one question. I was listening to you, and as I was listening to you, I couldn't stop thinking about the first photograph of a human being, or one of the images that some claim to be the first photograph of a human being, which is the image from Daguerre, the Boulevard du Temps. I think it's 1836, I guess. You remember the image? Yeah, I hope the public also to remember the image. And I couldn't stop, was this idea that would leave my mind listening to you. How these photographs reflect actually almost all the concepts that we have been talking today. I mean, for example, the different rhythms of the boulevard, the things that the image does not show, people walking around, carriages, horses, and whatever could be there at that moment. But also the power of the man who interrupts his movement and is registered in the image. And the way that reflects, for example, the power of interruption that you mentioned. And the way this image expresses the rhythms, thinking about what you said about Lefebvre, and also the way the image leaves out, because it doesn't actually show all these movements. So, which also talks to me about, the concept of estrangement in Kracauer. So taking in all the things, but thinking about the first image of a human being, I wanted to ask you, knowing that you are a philosopher and not a photographer, but thinking about our public, the young creators, universities, young photographers, I want to ask you if you think that in our cities today, given all the incredible amount of imagery we produce daily, is it possible to actually make new images? If we think about time, the city, and photography, and we think how this very first image almost contains everything we have been talking about here. It's like I have the intuition and the fear that no matter which image we can produce right now, it will do the same thing. It's like doing nothing because it is already done in the first image, So I know you are not a creator, you are not a photographer, but it's more like an inspirational question for our public. Is it possible to really, if we think in the field of city photography and time to make new images today? That's the question.
Thank you very much for your question. Because of the interference, I'm not sure if I understood all, because the sound is not perfect as I receive it. But I think you wrote. I didn't mention Daguerre's first photograph. Kracauer mentions Niepce. But you are totally right, because both the perspective and the way that Daguerre includes and excludes what I think, if I understood well, the idea that something is left out of that picture, and at the same time, a certain phantasmagorical presence, because the exposure time, the exposure period was quite long. So you have the traces, and already this idea of the presence, something that is present there, but not completely from that specific moment. So you have so many things in that photograph, like you said, that it almost includes. And it's like if we are quoting that, like a footnote of that photograph. That is also interesting for a philosopher, because we tend to always go back to the Greeks and to the roots of the philosophical tradition, and here it's like we can look at that photograph as a gesture in a certain sense, that is demanding to be read. That, like, the whole urban photography is unfolding that. Well, this is interesting as a theoretical, from a theoretical angle. But then the second part of your question is fundamental in a certain sense, and I think it's how to, if I understood it well, it's how to create new images, no? How to deal with this overwhelming avalanche of images that surround us, that circulate, that don't interrupt at all. No? Do we today experience interruption? Do we allow ourselves nowadays to pause, to interrupt the system? Like, I'm just thinking with you and your question. I don't have a straightforward answer to what you question, but this is, on the one hand, I think, if photography has the power of interruption, technically, it immobilizes moments, but then do we unfold that power? Do we process it? Are we able, not only as spectators, but also as producers of images, do we integrate this procedure of interruption into our practice? And I want to recall this idea of interruption that is not strictly technical, but also historical, and social and political. So I would say that, of course, if I want to be a pessimist, I would say that it's impossible to create new images. It's the new images, perhaps they only belong to small spaces, like museums, small groups of people interested in looking at photographs in a particular way. And this is a really, really small percentage of the way we experience photography today. So I think your students and the students in Colombia are facing to whom are we photographing today? If we want to photograph to mass society, it doesn't have any effect at all. Photographies are consumed instantly, they don't interrupt anything. But they have this micrological power, I think, still. If they are able to interrupt, and I think the authors that I brought today, they help us to think this power interruption in between the aesthetic elements of photography and the social and political. So I would say that new images can be created whenever we find an object or a state of affairs that we can attach to in a certain sense, but also that we feel or understand or think that it will, in a certain sense, create an estrangement in our current affair, in our current state of affairs. No, this is a bit abstract still, but of course it can be done with framing, with a particular style. In many ways, introducing text and images. I don't know. There are so many ways of working in city, but I would say, if I want to be optimistic, that given the social and political problems that our cities have nowadays, maybe we should not do the new thing, but if we micrologically interrupt something, I think it's worth it. No? And so if we give visibility to some things that are unnoticed, or if we create something strange, not curious, but strange in a strong sense, no? No. That is, it makes us think and look again and come back to the image.
I guess that's the challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're running out of time, but thank you very much, Nélio, for everything. Very interesting. And we'll stay in touch.
Thank you very much. And yeah, I look forward to
All right.
the rest of the conference. Bye. Thank you.
¿Le he hecho algo? ¿Será que es UN? Yo creo, ¿no? ¿Cómo llamará eso? Me parece uno que es UN 60JU 6500.